Joining us now, a Democrat from Washington State, the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, Congressman Adam Smith. Congressman, good to see you. So 4,000 National Guard and 700 Marines are being deployed by the Trump administration to Los Angeles. Do you know how many of them have actual assignments? And does the federal government have an adequate plan to feed and house them?
No and no. There doesn't seem to be any clear rules of engagement, as your previous guest just mentioned. They were sent there basically to protect the buildings and protect the ICE officers, but they weren't given clear instructions, and that's a problem. And look, I don't disagree that you should meet any sort of violent protest with law enforcement, but there's no evidence in this case that the LAPD wasn't doing that. There's, as I think Aaron Burnett did a great job of describing, the overwhelming majority of this was peaceful. Some were not. And it sounds like the local law enforcement were, in fact, dealing with the pieces of it that were not peaceful. So I think this is an overreaction by the president that does, A, run the risk of escalating the situation, but it also sets a dangerous precedent. President Trump has, definitely indicated that he'd like to use the U.S. military as sort of his personal police force. That's not what the Constitution contemplates. It's dangerous that he's setting this precedent.
Why do you think it's dangerous?
Well, because if law enforcement is used to do what the president wants over the objections of the local community, that once again concentrates an enormous amount of power in the hands of a president who, remember, promised to be a dictator on day one, has already violated an endless array of laws, constitutions, court orders. He's gone over and above what the law should have allowed. So if he starts to flex the power of the United States military across the country and local communities, especially for a protest that, relatively speaking, was this small to begin with, where might he take that? I think it is very much worth worrying about, and it certainly impacts, what the role of the Department of Defense is going to be going forward.
So this is what President Trump would say were he here. I'll say it nicer than he probably would. He would say the streets of Los Angeles were out of control. ICE agents were being threatened. We saw projectiles thrown at police cars. We saw cars burned. We saw violence. And in his first term, he listened to Milley and Esper, and they said, don't use the National Guard, and cities burned out of control, and he doesn't want to have that ever happen again, so he sent in the National Guard, and he's just trying to save the city and keep the peace. I'm not saying that's my view. That's what that's his view. What's your response to that?
This situation in Los Angeles didn't rise to that level. And by the way, I don't disagree that local law enforcement, even up in my own area, in Seattle, did not do an adequate job of stopping those protests from turning violent back in 2020. I don't disagree with that. But again, that's not what was happening here. I mean, you can go back and look at the tapes. It looked to me like the LAPD was responding forcefully, quickly, and aggressively. If the situation had reached the point where it got out of control, well, then we can have a conversation. But it sounds to me, or it looks to me in this situation, President Trump wanted this fight. He, A, wanted to be able to make the exact arguments that you just made. He wanted to focus on immigration enforcement and crime enforcement to distract attention away from the problems that his reconciliation bill is having. The bill that's going to knock like 12 million people off of health care and balloon the deficit by $2.5 trillion. I think President Trump wanted this fight, and I think he picked it. I don't think it was necessary, and as I said, I think it is a dangerous fight to pick.
Well, in addition to him maybe wanting this fight, he also wanted Democrats to be defending the protesters, some of whom, even if it's just a minority, a small minority, some of whom are resorting to violence, some of whom are nihilists, some of whom are, trying to violently attack police. Do you share the concern expressed by Senator Fetterman of Pennsylvania, Democrat, that it's important for Democrats to make sure that they're not damaging, not defending any of the violent people?
I wouldn't put it the way Senator Fetterman put it exactly. But look, I think Democrats do have a credibility problem when it comes to, immigration enforcement and border enforcement and also criminal justice enforcement. So I think it is a concern. But I haven't heard too many Democrats saying this is all fine and good and nobody should be arrested. I haven't heard a single one of them saying that. If you commit a crime, if you set a car on fire, if you throw things at law enforcement, if you block a freeway for that matter, you should be arrested. And yeah, in the past, I think my party has struggled to communicate that message. Again, I haven't really seen that this time. Yeah, you commit a crime, law enforcement ought to do it. But again, I'll come back to a point I made twice already. The LAPD was, in this case, enforcing the law.
Yeah.
So, like I said, I haven't heard Democrats saying, oh, let them do whatever they want to do. That has not been our position. Our position has been militarizing this is a huge risk of escalation, number one. And number two, the way President Trump is using the law to declare an emergency and then use the military is once again concentrating a frightening amount of power in a man who seems all too willing to shift towards an authoritarian way of running our government.
Congressman Adam Smith, Democrat of Washington State, thank you so much, sir. It's always good to see you.